want to welcome everybody to our first of the Eagle Talks series. My name is April Dye, and I'm the Director of Liberal Arts, and I am the coordinator for the LA 101 and 102 courses that a lot of you are here for this morning. And our series of talks are about the great ideas that Carson-Newman bases our principles on. So truth, beauty, goodness, courage, and justice. We're going to hear talks about all of those over the course of the semester. And we're going to hear from Carson-Newman professors about how they use those great ideas in their everyday lives, in their work, their research. And this morning, we're first going to hear from Dr. Kara Stooksbury. She's going to talk to us about goodness and thermonuclear war in 1980s pop culture. She is a Carson-Newman alum. She got her bachelor's degree in accounting from Carson-Newman. She then went to the University of Tennessee, where she received her master's and PhD in political science. And she is the chair of the Department of History, Political Science, and Sociology, as well as the pre-law advisor.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Dye, and thank you to the members of the Liberal Arts Committee for allowing me to speak to you today about goodness and global thermonuclear war as reflected in the pop culture of the 1980s. I'm a member of Generation X. What else would you really expect me to talk about? Right, so goodness and the 1980s. In the 1980s, we were really kind of confused about what kinds of things were good. We thought things like big hair and acid wash denim was good. It might interest you to know, when I was looking for this stock photo, that several ads popped up for acid wash denim. Can't decide whether I'm excited or horrified. Mostly horrified. We also thought mullets were good. Mullets are actually sort of different than big hair, and in all fairness, this is tennis star Andre Agassi. That's probably really more from the early 90s. And we learned later that this particular mullet was in fact a wig, because he would have rather had a mullet than a receding hairline. That is tragic. Michael Jackson seemed to imply that bad was in fact good in his 1987 follow-up to Thriller. And Michael Douglas told us in the film Wall Street that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. And I could go on as Dr. Dye and I were talking, neon colors, shoulder pads, all sorts of things that we thought were good. So while the term goodness depends on the context of the times and the way that the word is used, here I'm primarily talking about humanity. Kind, compassionate behavior toward others. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about humanity as a theme in the pop culture of the 80s, and more specifically in the movies and songs, a couple of examples of each of those, dealing with nuclear war. During the 1980s, the U.S. was embroiled in the Cold War. How many of you have seen Rocky IV? Okay, then you're practically experts on the Cold War. The rest of you need to go watch that. Okay, we learned Rocky, American, good. He didn't need high-tech equipment. He just needed to chop down some logs and walk through some snow. Ivan Drago, Russian, bad. Needed to cheat, needed to use steroids. And yet the Russians still cheered for Rocky. To give you some context of the Cold War, though, as many of you may have heard in your history classes, certainly you have in college and high school, it's a little more iffy. The Soviet Union and the United States were allies during World War II. After the war, though, we became enemies. Historians sort of disagree about actually the start and the end of the Cold War, but primarily point to sort of the historically strained relations between the two countries. different visions of what a post-World War II world would look like, with the Soviets sort of suggesting that each new superpower would basically remain dominant in their sphere of influence. So we had a situation where the U.S. and its allies were pitted against the Soviets and their allies. And when the Soviet Union first successfully tested nuclear weapons in 1949, we had a situation referred to as MAD, mutually assured destruction, so that each country would be able to literally obliterate the other with these weapons. So this led to a state of political hostility between the two powers, along with a nuclear arms race. I'm going to fast forward a little bit historically, because during the 1970s, the Cold War sort of thawed out a little bit, a period of what we call détente. And then the election of 1980 changed all of that. Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, if you count Bedtime for Bonzo as a movie, I don't know, it's a little iffy there. He had been a staunch anti-communist and actually met his wife, Nancy, when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and they were investigating another Nancy Davis for communist activities. Who knew that communism could bring people together and create true love? Right? So in 1980, Reagan campaigned against détente and advocated, of course, increased defense spending, increased nuclear weapons in order to protect the United States. In March 1983, there was quite a bit of rhetoric concerning the Soviet Union. Reagan delivered a speech in which he referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Okay. So again, sort of reinforcing this idea that people who adhered to this different ideology were evil, which in fact meant that we were better. So I have the quote there containing the evil empire reference. The fear that the two superpowers, because this rhetoric, of course, created more fear, we can just blow each other up, was reflected in the pop culture of the era. In fact, my niece asked me the other day, were you really afraid that you were going to die in a nuclear war? I was like, well, it was kind of a concern. As if middle school wasn't bad enough. Although there were some days I think I might have preferred dying in a war as to have to go to the 6th grade. Don't know about you. Hated every minute of it. So the politics were reflected in the pop culture. Some songs were pretty obvious about that. We're going to talk about those in a few minutes. Some maybe not so much. Prince. You heard of Prince? Purple Rain, there we go. And his song 1999, which just sounds like a good song you can dance to, right? You know, hey, woohoo. Part of the lyrics go, everybody's got a bomb. We could all die any day. But of course, before he's going to let that happen, he was going to dance his life away. All right. In movies, Red Dawn. Anybody seen Red Dawn? Okay, there's the original, and then there was the inferior remake. Because really, who can believe that Josh from Drake and Josh could really survive under those circumstances? This tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was on television shows that kids watched, even soap operas. There was a storyline on what was once a very popular soap opera, General Hospital, about good guys and bad guys and spies, and it was very clear that the bad guys were somehow linked to the Russians. We don't really see a lot of that in pop culture now. although, as I will talk about in a few minutes, seems to be making a bit of a comeback. The most important television show, which was really a TV movie, aired on ABC in November 1983. Okay, it was called The Day After, meaning the day after there had been a launch of nuclear missiles. For several weeks before it aired, there were warnings about the graphic nature of the content. There were many discussions among experts about how children might respond to this movie, about how people in general might respond to this movie. So it was extremely controversial at that time. In fact, experts advise that children under 12 shouldn't even watch it. I was just barely a teenager when I saw it. And it's really sort of one of those defining things for Gen Xers, I think. Most of us watched this when it was on TV, whether our parents knew we were watching it or not. And it had, I think a significant impact on how we view the world and really reinforced a lot of fears. So right now we're going to watch kind of an extended clip from this particular TV movie just to show you how terrifying things were. At the end of that movie, which is estimated over 100 million people in the United States watched live on television, there was a disclaimer, which should pop up here in a minute. But it said that the catastrophic events you have just witnessed are, in all likelihood, less severe than the destruction that would actually occur in the event of a full nuclear strike against the United States. It is hoped that the images of this film will inspire the nations of this earth, their peoples, and leaders to find the means to avert the fateful day. I'm not sure that your generation has anything from pop culture that's sort of the equivalent of that, but it certainly was, again, a hallmark of pop culture in the 1980s. And so while we remember this particular television movie because of the attack sequence, because of the destruction that it caused, the closing scenes and even the disclaimer emphasize really the need for humanity, the need for goodness, that the common good should outweigh political rhetoric and political posturing. Okay, it's also significant that it was called The Day After, not the day of, not the day before, to see the consequences, which the film goes on to show sort of the nuclear winter, the radiation poisoning that would occur in the event of such an attack. In terms of the response to the day after, President Reagan wrote in his diary on October 10th, 1983, he had seen a preview of the movie that ABC had sent him. And in his diary on October 10th, 1983, he wrote that it was powerfully done, it's very effective, and left me greatly depressed. Yeah, you think? And then he concluded that entry with, my own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent and to see there is never a nuclear war. So in terms of his response, his interpretation, it's, yes, this is a bad and horrible thing, but of course there were those in his administration who believed that in order to stop this thing from happening, we must have more nuclear weapons, which concerned, of course, a lot of folks. In terms of how the American public responded, and certainly re-emphasized fear of a nuclear war. And it is sort of interesting, if you look back at public opinion polls of the time, one of the top fears that individuals had, and for adults it maybe was 2 or 3, for children it was often a little higher on that list, the fear of dying in such a war. Okay, we, again, typically don't see those sorts of responses today. In addition to movies and television, I mentioned before that there were many songs that were written about the Cold War, more specifically nuclear war in the 1980s. I've listed a few of those there. Land of Confusion by Genesis, which you probably never heard. There's some puppets in there, and the puppets actually are quite scary, to be honest. 99 Red Balloons, does that ring a bell? Okay, there we go. Again, about children setting off a nuclear attack because they had, let some balloons loose in the air. In 1985, there was a song by Sting called Russians, and it was actually inspired by his viewing of Russian children's television shows. And it actually was number 16 on the Billboard chart, so it was fairly popular in the United States. Again, it emphasizes kind of humanity and goodness, but there's sort of a haunting theme there as well. He's actually, and we're going to listen to it in a second here, watch the video, he's critical of both superpowers. And, I mean, he can do that because he's British, so, you know, it's like, it doesn't have a side necessarily, except to emphasize the humanity and what such an attack could do to children. So, yeah, we're going to watch that. The line that always sticks with me is, what might save us, me and you, is if the Russians love their children too. And so in terms of, where we are now, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk was last spring. Certainly there was a lot of discussion about nuclear weapons, our relationship with North Korea. Somebody who studies political science, I find that interesting. And started, sort of making me think, well, how things are the same, how they're different in terms of how that issue is addressed. And it also occurred to me that to some extent, the 80s is still part of our pop culture. There was a show called The Americans on FX, I believe, which basically was the story of Russian spies posing as an American family. There was even an episode where they watched the day after. On a lighter note, there's the Goldbergs. I love that show. They also did an episode on the day after, although their take was certainly a little more humorous. This November, Creed 2 will be in theaters. It is... the plot is about Apollo Creed's son from Rocky IV fighting Ivan Drago's son from Rocky IV. So it seems to be, hard to get away from the 80s, and it's not just me listening to the 80s on 8 on Sirius XM on my way to and from Carson-Newman every day. Even the show American Horror Story, something that is a little more contemporary for you. The season opener started with a nuclear war. And for those of you who know who Joan Collins is, she was in it. I thought she was dead. How are things the same? How are they different? I think certainly, the emphasis on humanity, the emphasis on goodness, particularly in nuclear war, and the lack of humanity we often see in contemporary American politics. I've decided I'm sick of reading the comments on social media. I'm almost just sick of social media. I don't think it helps things. I think, in fact, it helps us, makes it easier to demonize the other side as opposed to sort of listening to each other and trying to emphasize that humanity that is so prevalent in some of the 80s pop culture. And that it's also really in the interest of politicians from both sides to divide us as opposed to unite us. So, those are, I think, some of the takeaways from that. And also maybe just don't wait for the world to end to be nice to other people. It's probably, better that we're nice to each other now. So, yeah, pay attention to what's going on. Personally, I think registering to vote to hold politicians accountable, to at least make them pay attention to what is good for most of us instead of their donors and corporations. And Mitra Sarshuri told me yesterday, and Mitra wouldn't lie, that it's Peace Week. So, in that regard, there are groups that do oppose nuclear weapons and believe that those should be dismantled. So there are a number of ways that we can be better. And I am going to be extremely good and say that you're dismissed.